Understanding different generations and the gap between them has many applications in all areas of life, from parents interacting with children to salespeople selling to people of older and younger clients, or pastors who work with teams of people of different ages. Terms like baby boomer, Generation X, the millennial generation, these terms describe groups of people of different ages. These terms arise from a theory that attempts to explain how different generations develop different value systems and the impact this has on how younger and older people interact with the world around them and with each other. Simply stated, generational theory explains that the era in which a person was born affects the development of their view of the world. Now, a generation tends to be about 20 years in length, representing roughly the time from the birth of a cohort of people to the time they come of age and start having their own children. The best up-to-date research into generational theory seems to be emerging from sociology and practical theology departments of top universities, with an emphasis on understanding how these value shifts will impact societal institutions, including religious institutions.
I believe that generational theory is really important, especially in the church setting, because we are called to work with one another, and oftentimes we are of different generations. So understanding where these generations are coming from and how to understand them, and also understand our own generation, and see that sometimes conflicts may arise. It's not because we don't see things the same way, but we have experienced them the same way because we are from different generations. Um, for experience, for example, I when I work with the Xer, the Generation X, which I am, they are very diluted, if you will, with the system, or the church, any institution in that matter. So me knowing that and understanding that, I will address them in a different way. I will understand better their standoffish position when it comes to a religion. Just like for the millennials, I will communicate with them with text and so on. And when I will talk with the GI generation, which is way older, oftentimes they will appreciate a phone call, but rather they would probably prefer a one-on-one conversation face to face. So it's important for me to understand these needs for a generation. In our tradition, we are often talking about the prodigal son. It's one of the best known parables in the Bible. And understanding that parables can be understood differently depending on generation is also a good tool for us to know in that generational theory. For example, when we talk about the prodigal son, the younger generation will say, well, he repented and came back to his father because of lack of money. But the GI generation will say, well, he came back to his father because he was lacking food. And the reason is their experience is different. So they will integrate their experience into the understanding of the parable. So right now, in Canada, lack of money can be more important than lack of food. But 70 years ago, it was all lack of food was just as scarce as a lack of money. We can also see in the scriptures, and that is very interesting, that King David had conflict with his sons, and that being is because their sons did not experience the same things he experienced. They were from two different generations. King David had to work hard to go where he was, to be where he was, as opposed to his children. His sons had everything handed to them. So we see not necessarily a conflictual generation, but a generation that experienced different things and see reality or their social environment on different angles. And we see what I really find that very interesting, because when we talk about generation and we say, well, generation do not change, it's always the same thing. And according to the generational theory, it is true, but it's almost like on a 80, 90 years cycle. So Socrates said, "Our youth now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for their elders and love chatter in places of exercise. They no longer rise when elder enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobbles up their food, and tyrannize their teachers." And Socrates said that. And we can also say that nowadays. The thing is, there's a cycle in generational theory where it does come back, and it is on a cycle. So it's important to also understand that everything comes back, same grievance, different eras. So hopefully you will understand better generational theory, but also be able to apply it on your own life, on your spiritual journeys, and your life in the church.
So sometimes judging by age isn't the only way to put yourself into a specific generational category. Myself, I kind of feel that I fall between a couple. So I'm going to ask you, Marco, which generation do you see yourself in, and do you match? Do your personality traits, do you feel that you share personality traits with the generation that you physically land in because of your age?
Yes, I do feel that I'm in between, not in between two, but I would have characteristic of one and characteristic of the other one. I'm Generation X, and I totally identify with that generation. That generation likes change, needs it, look for it. We are globally aware. We're not just like thinking locally, but we're thinking globally. Uh, we are lifelong learners, and that really describes me. I'm thrill seeker. I like contact sports, and things like that. So in that sense, I really do define myself as a Generation X. On the other hand, I find that also I'm in the GI generation. Um, they are defined by never giving up. They are civic minded. They conform. They like stability and predictability. And that is also me. On one hand, I like change. On the other hand, I like things to be clear and well defined. Um, I work hard just like they did. Um, so in one hand, I feel like I'm very much of a next generation. On the other hand, I also feel like I'm a GI generation where I like things well defined and well predictable, if you will. So I find myself in between the two, I would say. But it's important to understand, just like we see in the article that you can read by clicking over here, that there's always exceptions to the rules, or there's always exceptions to the description. Let's not put ourselves in boxes. Um, what defines me is not only just my generation, but also everything that affects me in my life, like my religion, um, my environment, my even my social class will define who I am really and where I can identify in this generational theory. And I like what the chapter 4 of Proverbs says. It's really a father talking to his child and saying, follow the ways of wisdom. And what's interesting, what I like to keep with this generational theory concept is learning the wisdom of my father and mother and the older generation, to keep in mind that I am myself a mix of all of these generations. I'm not just one, and that I'm learning from the wisdom or from what they have taught me during all this time. So we say oftentimes we history repeats itself, and that's when we can break the cycle and learn and go a little beyond from what we have been doing all the time. So being aware of different generation and what they taught us and what they learned is something that we want to incorporate nowadays.
Different generations have different amounts of power in the church, and as time progresses, we see the decision-making powers being handed from one generation to another. I wonder if you could share an experience that you've had, either personally or just that you know of through your church connections, of how watching power change or decision-making capabilities change from one generation to a next has been a less than smooth process.
Yes, Greg. One of the reason why generational theory interests me so much is the dynamic behind the conflicts, or the where does the person come from? What is their meaning behind what they're saying in their in the conflicts? For example, the Xers are really geared toward music. We are the much music MTV generation. We grew up with videos and lots of music. The silent generation is really a generation where they like order, they respect position, and they adhere to rules. So one day in worship, after worship actually, an older woman who was contributing a lot financially to the church said, well, today I didn't like the worship so much, especially not the choice of songs. They were not in the hymnal, and the young people were playing with guitars and bongos, and that should never be happening in a church. If that happens again, I will withdraw my monthly donations. So of course that starts a very interesting conflict for sure. On one hand, the younger generation wants to have more contemporary music. The older generation would like to have order and rules and maintain tradition. And so of course that comes in conflict. Adding to that, the money issue, meaning that if that woman withdraw her monthly donations, and she is giving a lot, then that would means what would that mean financially for the church? Because the younger generation is not as well off as the older generation. So we see an interesting dynamic going on in there. So that said, what can the younger generation do to resolve that conflict, and what can the older generation do to resolve that conflict as well? Where would be the middle ground where they would meet? And it's important to understand where the younger generations come from as well as the older generation, and that's where generational theory comes in church life and becomes so interesting.
We often discuss generational theory and connect it to the political structures of the church, or the people who are making decisions. But I wonder if you could share with us your opinion of how the different generations presented in a specific church can affect maybe the programs, the mission, the just sort of the nature and the attitude of the church. Are there specific types of classes or groups that relate better to one generation than another?
Well, first, before answering your question and telling you what I think about generations that go well together, work well together, I'd like to point out two generations that are really opposite, and I will tell you maybe why I think they are opposite. First, there's the silent generation that is opposite to the millennials. The silent generation really, they are conservative, hardworking, they are structured, and they prefer rules. In their mind, the idea of change or of progress is somewhat slow. It's something that is incremental and advanced, while we try to minimize risk as much as possible. They like to be safe in what they're doing and in the change they're trying to bring. Reason being, they were raised during a time of war, of the Big Depression and all that. So, they want things to be safe. I'm sorry, as opposed to the millennial generation. They are much more aware of not only their surrounding but the world at large. They are aware of different cultures, of different um, not only cultures but traditions as well. They see a much broader sense of the world than the silent generation, just because they have access to many types of medias and information. The millennials are confident. They are really confident, almost to the point that they seem to be arrogant. They have the ability to filter out every command, and they demand reason and rationale behind what you're asking them. The classic answer, do it because I say so, doesn't work with them. They need a rationale, they need an explanation. So compared to the silence generation, where they liked order and respected authority, the millennial are really different in that sense. So when it comes to church life, and when it comes to being missional as a church and going out there and implementing new programs and new ideas, these two generations really clash. One is much more conservative, the other one is much more liberal, and is used to change so much that 1 week something's going to be very in, and the week after it's going to be totally out, as opposed to the silent generation, where something was good for a long time. So just in that sense of their fast-paced life, millennials will have much more conflicts with the silent generation. That said, I believe that the millennials and the baby boomers have much more in common. The baby boomers were the peacemaker. They were anti-war. They manifested against the war in Vietnam and so on. And the millennials are just as globally aware of that, what's going on in the world at this point. So in that sense, millennials and baby boomers would get along together much better than any other generation, in my personal opinion. And the baby boomers and the millennials, that would compare to the grandparents and their grandkids, if we're talking about age range here. So in that sense, I believe that the millennials and baby boomers are much more agents of change and of mission and implementing new things in the church than any other combination of generation. Even my generation I'm X generation. I'm Generation X, and I'm in sandwich between the two. And I believe that the millennials and the baby boomers have much more in common and can work much better together. But again, this is only my opinion. What I'd like to know, or what I would like to ask you, is what does generational theory say about God, or how can we use generational theory to understand God better?
I think actually kind of like my answer to the similar question for faith stages, generational theory describes people. It describes humanity. We take a look at individual generations and see that there are some traits or some mindsets or some personalities that are similar across people from that generation. But if you're going to make me say how this relates to God, or how this describes God for us, I think once again it's showing how everybody's relationship with God is their own. Although it might be similar to other people in their own generational category, It's their own relationship. And then we jump to a different generation and people see God in a very different way. Yet it's the same God. Yet God is in relationship back with them. So once again, I think it describes a God who is spectacularly larger than any of us understand, whose breadth is so far beyond our poor, simple human minds. No matter what generations come along, no matter what ways people interact with authority figures or where they find their strength and whether they connect more to their peers or the generation below or above, their relationship with God is just as valid. And God shares the same grace and mercy and love with them, no matter who they are.
Understanding all this about the generational theory, where do you think, according to you, the church will be in 20 or 30 years from now? What kind of impact will it have in society, or what will the role of the church will be in society? With all this knowledge of generational theory, where do you think the church will go in about 30 years from now?
Oh, that's kind of a loaded question, is it? I think there's a lot of people who are trying to answer that question right now. A lot of people in a lot of different denominations and a lot of different faith groups and religions across the world trying to figure out where it's going to go. I mean, we're seeing decline in numbers in every denomination. Locally, there are some raises, but in general, the decline. The people are less and less focused on religion. If we look at 20, 30 years from now, when the people who are currently the millennials, when that group are now the decision makers for organizations like the United Church of Canada, I think that we might have to take a stronger look at definitely where the internet fits into the discussion, where this idea that information is always available 24/7 at your fingertips. You've got a question, Google it. You want to talk to somebody, they're on Facebook. That immediacy is certainly something that has to fit into church going forward. This idea of 1 hour on Sunday morning being the only time that you're social with your fellow churchgoers, that's just not going to work. There's a frenetic pace, there's a busyness to the lives of millennials that it just doesn't really allow for that sort of forced structure. I think maybe we're going to see that people will be consuming whether it's a preaching style message or whether it's a Bible verse or some sort of exegesis or some sort of Bible study. I think people are going to be consuming that on their own time when they have time to get it. And it might be that the idea of a social time when you learn the Bible and learn messages, the idea of learning and social might have to be split up, where social is more something that you're doing online or in person, and then the learning together might become more individual. So that's one guess, just knowing the sort of nature of millennials at this point, that we might have to split up some of those things that we've gotten really used to them belonging together. The idea that Sunday morning is a social time and a learning time, a time for community, try and get all that stuff in one. I don't think that's going to work as well anymore.
This is a purely subjective question, but I wonder, in your point of view, what would be the generation of Jesus? Where would he fit in all these generation? Like millennial, X generation, so on and so forth. Where do you think Jesus would lie in these generation? I'm curious.
That's kind of a tough call, because I think if we take any one specific person and try and figure out what generation they come from, if you don't know their age, because the generational theory is more of a generic thing and it kind of creates some pigeonholes that you can stick people in, any one person is very likely to not exactly fit with any one generation. If we look at some of the characteristics that we see in the person of Jesus, I think we see a real a connection to his fellow man and a social and a civic responsibility similar to what we would see in the which one is that? The boomer generation. But then we also see him somewhat fighting with the authorities of the time, which is more similar to Gen X. So it would be tough to put Jesus into a specific generation, just the same as taking any one person would be tough if you didn't know what generation they belonged to. Well, I guess that wraps up our time for generational theory. And just before we say goodbye, I'd like to ask you to follow a couple of more assignments just to keep your learning going. First off, I want you to think about the characteristics and personality traits of the silent generation and write down a few. Well, I guess that wraps our time today for discussing generational theory. Thanks so much for joining in. And just before we go, I'd like to leave you with a few assignments of your own. First, taking a look at the personality traits and characteristics of the silent generation, what do you think would be their view of God? Secondly, although we've already taken a kick at this ourselves in our question and answer period, I wonder if you would like to look at the next 30 years in your church or the church at large and suggest what it might look like based on who the generations are that will be in charge, and perhaps the generations yet to come that we know nothing of. And thirdly, we want to make sure that you've taken time to write down some of your own personality traits and things that are important to you and see how they fit with the generation that you fit with just based on your date of birth. Well, thanks again so much, and we'll see you soon on another episode of The Loquacious Lay Ministers.